Hello, and welcome back to the Bible Difficulties and Answers podcast. I'm your host, Lance Smith, and I've got a fascinating topic for us today. Last week, I teased the question of how the sons of Heth could have been in Hebron around 2050 BC, when their kingdom was in what is now modern Turkey. But today, we're going to take a detour back to the story of Abraham and Isaac for one more important look. So here's the big question. Is it possible that God didn't know how Abraham would respond to his command to sacrifice Isaac? In Genesis 22:12, God says, "Now I know that you truly fear God." Does this suggest that there's a limit to God's omniscience? This is a perplexing passage, isn't it? It makes us wonder, can an all-knowing God actually experience uncertainty? If God is omniscient, why would he need to test Abraham? Was this test really for God, or was there a deeper reason behind it? Today, we'll break down this question through four key perspectives, and by the end of this episode, we'll have a clearer understanding of what this passage is really saying about God's perfect knowledge. Let's kick things off with Genesis 22:12 from the New Living Translation. "Don't lay a hand on the boy," the angel said. "Do not hurt him in any way, for now I know that you truly fear God. You have not withheld from me even your son, your only son." All right, now here's the issue as outlined in the Big Book of Bible Difficulties. This verse implies that God did not know how Abraham would respond to his command, since it was only after Abraham obeyed that God said, "Now I know that you truly fear God." However, the Bible declares elsewhere that God, in his understanding is beyond comprehension. That's Psalm 147:5. And that he knows the future even before it happens. That's Isaiah 46:10. And he knew his people in advance, and he chose them to be like his son. That's Romans 8:29-30. So what gives? How do we reconcile God's apparent need for a test with his all-knowing nature? And now here's a solution from the Big Book of Bible Difficulties. In his omniscience, God knew exactly what Abraham would do since he knows all things. That's Psalm 139:2-4, Jeremiah 17:10, Acts 1:24, and Hebrews 4:13. However, what God knows by cognition and what is known by demonstration are different. After Abraham had obeyed God's command, he demonstrated what God always knew, namely, he feared God. Here again, the Bible, addressed as it is to human beings, speaks from a human perspective. In like manner, a math teacher might declare, "Let's see if we can find the square root of 49." And then, after demonstrating it, declare, "Now we know that it is 7," even though she knew from the beginning what the answer was. All right, back to me. To begin, I think the key to understanding Genesis 22:12 lies in revisiting Genesis 22:1, where we learn something Abraham does not. God is testing him. Genesis 22:1 clearly states, sometime later, God tested Abraham's faith. This sets the stage for the entire narrative, revealing God's purpose, though Abraham remains unaware of what is to come. That being said, Genesis 22:12 has been the subject of much theological debate regarding God's omniscience and the nature of Abraham's test. There are four key perspectives for us to consider for this verse. First, let's begin with God's omniscience. Many theologians argue that God, being omniscient, already knew how Abraham would respond. The test wasn't for God, it was for Abraham. For this, there are three quick points. The first, the test allowed Abraham to demonstrate and grow in his faith. The second, it provided an opportunity for Abraham to prove the genuineness of his character and obedience. And third, the test was for Abraham to discover the depths of his own faith and willingness to obey God. A great summary of these points comes from a December 15th, 2006 devotional on Ligonier.org titled, "Abraham Passes His Test." It suggests that when God said, "Now I know," he wasn't expressing uncertainty. Instead, he was speaking in human terms to highlight that Abraham had passed the test. This moment revealed what it truly means to fear God and be known by Him. The second perspective is God's self-limitation, and here's where things get really interesting. Some believe that God may have chosen to limit His foreknowledge in this instance. This concept aligns with open theism. There are two quick keys for this perspective in Genesis 22:12. The first, this perspective sees God entering into a genuine test, not knowing the outcome. And second, it aligns with theological concepts of God's self-limitation or kenosis, that means emptying, to engage with humanity. Okay, we covered this in earlier podcasts, the view known as open theism, and Genesis 22:12 is a verse specifically used by open theists to suggest a new way of viewing God's nature. As a quick refresher, open theism is a theological view that emphasizes the dynamic and relational nature of God's knowledge and actions in relation to the world, particularly human free will. According to open theism, God knows all possibilities, but does not have exhaustive knowledge of future free human actions because they haven't happened yet. As Wayne Jackson of the Christian Courier writes in his article, "Does God limit His own foreknowledge?" it includes this statement. But does God choose to limit His own knowledge, thus electing not to know certain things? Some contend that He does, and they feel there is scriptural support for this idea. For example, when Abraham was poised to offer Isaac, the Lord said, "Now I know that you fear God," suggesting, it is alleged, that God had shielded His knowledge regarding the patriarch's earlier level of faith. Matt Slick, from his December 8th, 2008 article, Genesis 22:12, "For now I know that you fear God," and open theism, attacks the open theism view head-on. He writes, "Since we can see that it is not consistent with Scripture and logic to say that God did not know that what was in Abraham's heart, and that God did not know what Abraham would do, we can conclude that God was speaking to Abraham in terms that Abraham was familiar with. This is not at all foreign to Scripture. In Genesis 3:9, after Adam's sin, God calls to Adam and asks, 'Where are you?' Are we to say that God did not know where Adam was in the garden? Of course not. God makes statements often designed to reveal to us a truth that needs to be presented. In fact, God often asks questions He already knows the answer to. In Adam's case, the where was dealing with a spiritual condition, not a physical location. In Abraham's case, God was simply relating to Abraham in terms consistent with what Abraham would understand, particularly after the actual event with Isaac on the altar," end quote. Slick then goes on to add this powerful conclusion, and I quote, "God was speaking for Abraham's benefit. That is, it was Abraham who needed to hear that God was acknowledging that Abraham feared Him. The test was not for God, but for Abraham, and the words, 'Now I know,' were not for God, but for the man who needed to hear God affirm His faithfulness. Abraham is a man locked in time," end quote. Back to me. Open theism is a fascinating perspective, but it contradicts the traditional Christian view of God's omniscience and immutability. It suggests a relational dynamic God, but many scholars reject the idea that God limits His own knowledge. Next is anthropomorphic language. This third perspective focuses on the concept of anthropomorphic language, suggesting that the phrase, "Now I know," in Genesis 22:12, serves as a literary device. This interpretation holds that God is using human language to convey His approval. According to this view, God has always known how Abraham would respond, but the test was intended for Abraham to demonstrate his faith, both for himself and others. Now, I find this perspective closely intertwined with the idea of God's omniscience. It's really just two sides of the same coin. The fourth perspective is a demonstration for others. Finally, some scholars propose that this test extended beyond Abraham, serving as a demonstration for a wider audience, perhaps angelic beings or even future generations. It illustrated what it truly means to fear God and place complete trust in Him. While this idea is sometimes mentioned in passing in scholarly discussions, it lacks extensive research or detailed examination to further support its implications here on this podcast. So where do I land? The idea that God didn't know how Abraham would respond doesn't hold up. God's omniscience is a key aspect of His divine nature. Genesis 22:12 is best understood as God speaking in a way Abraham and we could comprehend. The test wasn't for God to learn something new. It was for Abraham and for us to witness the power of faith and obedience. The next time you read this passage, remember, God's knowledge is never in question. He is omniscient. The test was for Abraham to prove his faith and for us to see faith in action. Thanks for tuning in. Next week, we'll finally tackle that archaeological puzzle. How could the sons of Heth have been in Hebron around 2050 BC when their kingdom was in what is now modern Turkey? I promise it'll be a fascinating dive into ancient history and you won't want to miss it. And as always, studying the Bible isn't just about finding answers. It's about asking the right questions. And thanks for listening. As always, we love hearing from our listeners. You may reach us at our website, BibleDifficultiesAndAnswers.podbean.com, or you may reach out to me directly at our email address, BibleDifficultiesAndAnswers@gmail.com, with any questions, comments, concerns, fits of righteous indignation, or just to say hi. I'm always glad to hear from our listeners. Also, please like and subscribe to this podcast. Tell a friend or two as well. And also write a review and give it a 5-star rating on Apple Podcast, Podbean, Spotify, YouTube, or any of your venues of choice. It really does help get the word out about the most amazing book ever written. Again, I'm Lance Smith. Until next time, I wish you good luck, good health, and God bless. So long, everybody.